Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. This video is going to be a combination of a video essay about book bannings and a review of This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson, because I just had way too many thoughts about this topic to leave it solely in my end of the month reading recap. I'm gonna kind of cater this information so that no matter how you feel about book bans, what your position is, that there's something you can gain from it, but I do kind of acknowledge that the people who are gonna probably click on this video are the ones who are against book bans, just in all shapes and sizes. But just know that even if that's not you, you're still welcome here. I will make sure I'm talking to you too, not just the people who are very against book bans. Before we get started, I have a big announcement. My Etsy shop is finally open. It is Backyard Bear Shop on Etsy. I will link it in the description. I'll also put all the socials down there. I think there's just an Instagram. Yeah, there's just an Instagram. Really appreciate it if you go check it out. If you follow the Instagram account or the shop, if you leave likes and favorites on the items, that would really help me out. So thank you so much, and let's get started. I have a lot of moments when I think about my first year in college that I can remember thinking, oh, I'm not in high school anymore. The one I'm gonna tell you about happened my second semester. It's March 2021. I'm just an itty bitty little freshman, no idea what's going on. I'm taking this class called Free Speech in America, and we're talking about the Comstock Act of 1873, which is, the way it was originally used was to prevent obscene material from being mailed. And the guy it's named after, Anthony Comstock, was inspired to be an activist against vice after he served in the Civil War and saw all his fellow soldiers buying lewd materials, lewd photographs. I remember my professor saying to us, "Now, you hear me say Victorian pornography. I bet you're thinking they're just showing some ankle or something." Nope, wrong. And then he proceeds to show us photographs, black and white photographs of Victorian people getting it on as an example of this. And then he immediately switches and we don't talk about it anymore. But I was so just shook that I was having to see naked people at 9:30 in the morning on a random Tuesday. Like, I'm barely awake. It was, I use that, I love telling that story because it's just such an extreme example, but it illustrates so well, like, there are no rules once you're in college. You know, like, all these things you thought were off the table you could finally talk about. And that includes sexuality. For someone who went to a high school like mine, that is just an insane experience that you never really get used to. So I'm from a small town. My graduating class from high school was about 75 people. It was incredibly conservative. My teachers would not even say the word sex, never mind talk about it. I remember whenever we did the Romeo and Juliet unit, my teacher was too scared of accidentally showing us the nudity in the 1968 Romeo and Juliet, that she just didn't show it to us at all. But you know what they did show us in high school? We watched the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. You know, like, very accurate, gruesome, explicit violence. Yeah, we got to see that. For the month of June, I read This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. This book is described as your coming out handbook, a guidebook to everything you need to know about being gay. This ranges from coming out advice to a list of your queer icons and a breakdown of harmful stereotypes about queer people. There is also some comprehensive information about sex that would have given my school librarian an aneurysm. I kid you not, she would white out anything even remotely romantic in all the books, to the point that I just stopped checking out books from there because half of them were unreadable. So I do a reading challenge every year. I'll link in the description because I can't remember the name of it right now, but one of the prompts is to read a banned book. And so at the time, the 2024 data wasn't up when I was looking for a book to read this year, but the 2023 data was, and This Book is Gay was ranked number 3. Now, I am a very strong advocate for the freedom to read. There's not a single book that I can think of that I genuinely think should be banned in either my public library or, like, across my state or even across the country, not a single one. But my initial reaction reading this book was, oh, I get it. Not because I agree that it should be banned, but because this is so far from what was acceptable to talk about in my community, especially my school. I just know how the people in my community would have reacted and would have been terrified of giving kids this book. We're not talking about it as adults. We don't want, we're not gonna let the teenagers talk about it. Because of that, I think there's a bigger conversation to be had about this book, which is why I'm making this video. Because, just because something makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean it's bad. And just because this book gave me a lot of conflicted opinions doesn't mean I run away from them or I ignore them. So this video is kind of me teasing that out. Now, when we get into why people say they're challenging books, it's almost always to protect children from harmful information. And that's good and dandy in practice, right? I think most of us want to protect children, especially younger children who don't have the ability to make decisions about what they should and shouldn't be reading yet, or how to navigate the internet appropriately. We always call it harmful information or inappropriate, but what does that actually mean? We go back to the class I took, Free Speech in America. This was a history class, and over the course of the semester, we looked at dozens of court cases about free speech lawsuits. We kind of were, over the course of the class, trying to tease out where freedom of speech begins and ends. And we started the class by my professor asking us what shouldn't be protected under the First Amendment. As a class, our initial thoughts were, yeah, someone might punch you in the face if you're an asshole, but the government shouldn't arrest you. And then my professor asked, what about hate speech? And we're all like, we shouldn't allow hate speech because there's violent intent behind that. And then my professor asked us to find what hate speech is, and we couldn't come up with anything definitive that would cover every single scenario. And then my professor asked, what about child pornography? We were like, oh yeah, no, that should definitely be banned. And then he went, what about copyright? And it went on and on like that for 80 minutes. At the beginning of the semester, I would have told you that I think we all have free speech. I think that it is protected. I think that you can pretty much say what you want without facing a lot of legal repercussions. Now I would say that most people don't have freedom of speech. They say you do, but most people will be policed, will have their speech policed in some form or fashion. Here's part of my final paper. I'm going to read one of the paragraphs to you that I feel like kind of breaks down this argument that I have. And I am bringing this up because it is relevant to the types of books that get banned, so I'm not just talking out of my ass right now. The US may have one of the richest economies today, but it also has the highest poverty rates of any developed country. Extreme economic inequality exists in the US, and many minority groups experience this at higher rates. Since Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976, followed by Sins United v. FEC in 2010, spending money has been considered a form of speech. Therefore, those with the most money get to speak the most. The two court cases mentioned, so Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United versus the FEC, are basically about funding caps for donors for political candidates. Basically, billionaires can spend however much they want on the political candidate of their choice, which means that if you don't have a billionaire supporting you, it will be very difficult to get your campaign off the ground. I don't know if anyone else remembers getting a bunch of hi, it's Kamala texts during the election, but that's why. It's because, you have to get hundreds and hundreds of small donations from middle-class families to match your opponent, who is funded by the richest man in the world. Because of that, middle-class people and working class especially have very little control over who ends up on their ballot. Meaning the people that are on the ballot who we can vote for maybe aren't who the people actually want. That's just kind of the biggest example of it, but I do think it snowballs. The gist: if you're wealthy, you have better access to freedom of speech. And because we live in America, a country that enslaved an entire ethnicity of people and then segregated them for the majority of the history, and still in some ways discriminate against them, or, a group that was not allowed to start working until a couple decades ago and was forced to stay in the home, have babies, get married, and not have any, wealth of their own, that means some people are going to have better access to wealth than others. Basically, what it boils down to is the people who have the best access to wealth are white men, especially straight white cis men, especially men with generational wealth. So if your parents are wealthy, then it will be easier for you to build upon that wealth. You're not in that group. You have less access to money, and you're always going to be punching up. And if you're punching up, that means the billionaires can punch down harder. That means you have less access to freedom of speech. What does this have to do with banned books? Your right to read and your right to freedom of expression are inherently linked. The ALA is your best friend when it comes to this. There is a Library Bill of Rights, which basically explains what libraries are supposed to provide its citizens. I'm going to read you its first tenet. Books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people of the community the library serves. Materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. This means that your library is required to provide you with access to all types of information because it's in the public's best interest to have that information. We also have a freedom to read statement, which has a bunch of tenets that break this down, but basically, you are responsible for deciding what you should and what you should not be reading. If you're a minor, that's your parents' responsibility. Because, the libraries can't make that decision for you, and they shouldn't. That's not their job. They have an obligation established by the ALA to make sure whatever information you need, you have access to. And this isn't just like a small movement for freedom of expression. The ALA is the law when it comes to libraries. Any library you go to, the librarian behind the counter, at least one of them, probably more, will have gone to a school that is ALA accredited to get a master's in library science. These are the values that librarians are being taught in school and are supposed to carry on into their community. I also don't think that most people realize how much work goes into getting a book from, an author to a library so that's in front of you, because it's not like the librarians are just pulling up and you're just making decisions willy-nilly. First, an author has to write a book, then it has to be edited, then it has to be sent to an agent. If you're a new author, that can be really difficult. Then once it's been picked up by an agent and a publishing house, it's going to be sent to editors, maybe even sensitivity readers. It's going to be reworked. There are going to be hundreds of drafts of it, and then it's going to be published. And once it's, in the publication process, it's going to be sent to reviewers. I'm just a few off the top of my head. Kirkus Reviewers, Booklist, Publishers Weekly, Library Journal. There are professional reviewers there who are trained to look at books. They're going to read the book and say, we recommend this for a library. We don't recommend this for a library. This book is great. This book sucks. That's their whole job. And then a librarian, once the book is out, will look at those reviews, look at the actual content of the book, and then look at their collection development policy. Every library should have one. It's basically the guidelines for what the library should and should not have in its collection, is a concrete policy that determines what books belong and what books don't. It's not I know it when I see it. Shout out Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. Just a side note, that is the dumbest quote. How is it that Parks and Rec has a better definition of pornography than an actual Supreme Court justice?
For me, it's when the penis goes in.
Point being, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that goes between getting a book from, the void to your library shelves. People who are looking at it are trained to know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate for the audience it's meant for. Obviously, they're looking at broad demographics, but that's how this works. I mean, maybe I'm too immature to read an adult romance book without giggling, but the vast majority of adults are. So maybe I'm the problem. But books still get banned, and we seem, as a country, to have kind of some agreed upon definitions of what inappropriate work means. Here's some more statistics for you. There were 2,452 unique titles targeted for censorship last year, and let's look at what they have in common. Let me read them off for you. I'm only gonna read the first 5 top challenge books though, because I'm lazy. All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, LGBTQ plus content. Genderqueer by Maya Kababe, which has LGBTQ plus content. The Blue Sky by Toni Morrison, which has depictions of sexual assault and DEI content, whatever the hell that means. The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky for sexual content and LGBTQ plus content. Tricks by Alan Hopkins for sexual content. You're probably gonna pick up on some themes. Books get targeted. We're talking about queerness. We're talking about sex, race, drug use, more, but those are kind of the ones I noticed. It's also important to note that most of these challenges are not coming from the concerned parents in your neighborhood. 72% of challenges come from pressure groups and organized movements. These are like small groups of people, but they're incredibly powerful. They're really working to censor these books that cover these themes. You know, yes, sexual assault, drug use, especially drug abuse, these are not great, but they're gonna be covered in the books in a way that is appropriate for their target audience. So if it's a young adult book, it'll be talked about in a way that is appropriate for teenagers. You know, again, because it's been reviewed by publishers, reviewers, librarians. It's looked at in that context from people who are familiar with that age group. So let's talk about This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. This book has been challenged for talking about queerness and sex. It does both those things. You took the bait. The book is in fact gay. Let's look at it together. I do have some issues with this book. I studied sociology in school, so I'm used to talking about queer theory, so I have a little bit better understanding of it than most people, and so a lot of my critiques are going to come from just that. One of my biggest problems with it, just first of all, is it's written for teenagers, and I think the language was designed to be kind of less serious so that it didn't feel like, oh, I'm reading a super serious, down, sad book about the realities of being gay. You know, I think it's worth mentioning that most people realize for the first time that they may be queer when they're tweens, teenagers, young adults. Even if they don't have the words for it, they know something's off. So it makes perfect sense that it's marketed in that way, and it makes perfect sense that that's the way the language is, but I'm an adult, and I would rather you use adult words with me. I would rather you don't use euphemisms. I did feel like Maud from The Big Lebowski with that one scene where she's introduced, where she's like,
the word itself makes some men uncomfortable. Vagina.
For starters, I'm glad this book exists. I think it would have made me feel better about myself if I knew I could go and check it out. It came out before I came out. I think it was 2015. I came out for the first time in 2017, I think. So I would have been able to check out this book. I just didn't know it existed. But I think I would have benefited from it at that age. Overall, it does a great job of saying, hey, welcome to the community. We're happy to have you. You are valid no matter what. Which is important because if you're a queer person, especially if you're not in a supportive family or in a supportive community, you're not getting that message a lot. And it can be really nice to hear that, even if it's just in a book from a stranger. I also want to stress that this is some of the best sex education I've ever received. I'm from a red state. We have abstinence-only laws, but I didn't even get abstinence-only sex ed. We were told periods exist and that you should never send nudes of yourself to your boyfriend. That was it. So I was getting all my information in high school from my friends and from like Reddit. Great sources, right? This book actually answered all those awkward questions that you have when, you know, you're first getting into relationships and you're first starting to think about it. Beyond that, it also had information about safe sex practices and STDs. I wish some people that I went to high school and even middle school with, because there were people getting freaky in middle school. I wish that they had this information, not because it's gay necessarily, but just because they weren't getting it anywhere else. Juno Dawson is like a health teacher from the UK, basically. So she's used to working with kids this age, and she knows what questions you have and also how to, answer those while also stressing being safe. You're not getting that level of expertise on the internet where most of us are going when we start having those questions, at least for people growing up in my town. So like there's good information in it, and it is really nice to have it from a trusted source. At the same time, I completely understand why it was banned, because in my community, we're not even giving straight people this information. We got a rando who came down one day, once a year, told us that periods exist, and then left. And that was it. Like, we did not get told that STDs exist. We did not get told sex equals baby. Like, we had no information. So if you're going beyond that, from even just basic information to comprehensive, like, sex positive information, I can totally imagine how people are gonna freak out. But at the same time, I'm glad that this book exists, because it's like, okay, that information is there, and kind of made me realize how bad it is, if that makes sense. Because the reality of it is that teenagers are having sex. You can tell them whatever you want, they're still gonna do it. And if you don't give them the information they need to do it safely, then they're not going to do it safely. If your only options for sex ed are Reddit or Juno Dawson, who would you rather pick? I pick Dawson, because at least she's citing her sources, and at least she makes me feel good about myself. I read the 2015 edition of this book. It's been republished a few times since then, and I hope that some of the critiques I make aren't issues anymore. I'm gonna put these out there anyway. My biggest issue with this book is that it focuses so heavily on gay men. It is so unbalanced. Honestly, it kind of made me laugh a few times, because I was like, why are you giving me just the most detailed information about gay subcultures, but you can't even like tackle the basic lesbian stereotypes that exist? The only queer women stereotypes she mentioned were the man haters, and then the all lesbians secretly want to be men. Not really any of the others. And like, all the sections about queer women were so much shorter compared to the ones about gay men. Juno Dawson, for anyone who doesn't know, she's a trans woman. She refers to herself in the book as a gay man, so this is obviously the experience she's coming from and probably feels the most comfortable talking about, but the book suffers for it. I'm just gonna give one example of how I think including more lesbian information could have been helpful. She alluded to the U-Haul lesbian stereotype a few times, but didn't actually talk about it. If you don't know, the joke is that lesbians bring a U-Haul to the first date, because queer women move so fast in relationships, and they move into together after only like one or a couple of dates. I will say every single queer woman I know has had this happen at least once, where you sit down to a date or you meet another queer woman and you immediately fall in love with her and you think she's the one. Pretty much any older queer woman will tell you that, yeah, you're gonna go on a date, you're gonna meet a woman, she'll be awesome, you'll think she's the one. Step back, take your time, go on another date with another person, feel it out. Don't rush things. I wish I knew that a couple years ago when I got into a U-Haul situation. We both kind of fell in love with the idea of the other person, so whenever the other person started doing things that kind of conflicted with that idea, we both didn't know how to cope. At the time, I was like, it's okay to U-Haul because this is just what's expected of me. I'm expected to move fast, even though I don't want to, and even though this doesn't feel natural or healthy to me. This doesn't only happen to queer women. This can happen to someone regardless of orientation or what your partner's gender is. And I think that you can have some really important conversations about dating overall if you look at this stereotype. So I would have loved to see this discussed in the book. I think it would have been really helpful for me at the time when I was coming out. So another problem I have is that's just not current with a lot of the queer theory that I was learning in college. I started college in 2020. It's been 5 years now. Published in 2015. It's been 10 years now, but you can feel the 10 years. One thing was there was a lot of references to the born this way strategy. One of the ways that society has made it more acceptable to be gay is we say, I was born like this, I've always been gay, this is part of who I am, you can't change it, this is how God made me. This is great because it shows that sexuality is not a choice, and it can't change even if it's not socially acceptable. Therefore, you have to accept me or reject me, because I can't, like, there's no other solution. And it's named after the Lady Gaga song. So the problem that a lot of people now have with this strategy makes it seem like sexuality is permanent or fixed. For some people it is, but it's not that way for everyone. It means that if you come out multiple times in your life, then like one coming out kind of negates all the others, and that can feel kind of icky sometimes. It's a little harder for people to wrap their heads around, because you're moving not from I was born this way to this isn't a choice, this is who I am, and that's an ongoing process. That's kind of where things are moving. That's kind of the direction they need to move in. So another thing about this book, there's a lot of fixation on labels, which I didn't like. Especially, I feel like a lot of people nowadays are moving away from you have to have a label. There are a lot more people who just identify as queer or use another umbrella term. Labels are great for some people. I like a label, but not everyone does. They can feel really restrictive for some people, and that's okay. Did feel like Juno Dawson was taking a, hey, have you felt off your whole life? Here's a place where you belong. Here's where everything makes sense. Here's your community. Which can be really comforting for some people, but not for everyone. And I hope that in future editions she kind of moves away from that. The YA book, Felix Ever After by Kaysen Callender, does a great job of like showing how this works, like how labels can be comforting for some people and also restrictive for others. Great book. So there are a few more things. Those were kind of the main ones and the ones I want to yap about the most. There could have been more intersectionality. There could have been more about all the other letters after the LG. You know, like if the lesbians were ignored, then you know the bisexual people were ignored, you know the asexual people were ignored. Like there could have been a better balance, you know. This book really is for teenage boys coming out as gay. I hope in future editions that Dawson includes some collaborators who are from different identities so they can talk in more depth about their experience with that community. For the 2015 version, that's it. Those are my thoughts. Now, let's assume, for sake of argument, that I hated this book. I didn't, but let's say I did. I thought it was awful. I thought it was problematic. What do I do with it then? Do I ban it? No. I've read a lot of books I hated. A lot of books I hated. That doesn't mean that they are like 100% bad and they should never be read by anyone again. It doesn't even mean that they're harmful for the majority of people, even if they were harmful for me. Each book is going to have some things that are good or progressive, and some things that are bad or regressive. So I'll use an extreme example that we like to talk about over on Gen Z TikTok. J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling, for all intents and purposes, is a problematic author. She actively uses her platform to target the transgender community to the point that she is actually hurting women like herself, cis women specifically. Do you guys remember during the Olympics when she was targeting Iman Khalif, the Algerian gold medalist boxer? That woman was not trans. She was just attacking a cis woman for no reason because she's so full of hate, I guess. This is a wealthy woman who actively uses her platform and her ability of speech to harm other people. There are a lot of people who have sworn her off, who are boycotting her, who are not going to read her books anymore. But I think it's important to remember that just because she is a hateful person and actively uses her platform for harm doesn't mean that her work itself is 100% bad or problematic. We can talk about it. Stick with me. If you're a big J.K. Rowling hater, stick with me. It's an extreme example. Every single Harry Potter fan I know is like stone cold gay. I'm not even kidding. I've read so many Harry Potter fanfics that are just some of the most progressive woke mind virus I've ever seen in my life, like in direct opposition to her platform. And beyond that, these books are very popular and they have had a huge impact on future fantasy novels. You know, so you can acknowledge that. You can acknowledge that there are things in the book that changed the fantasy genre, that brought a bunch of people together, especially underrepresented people, while also acknowledging that J.K. Rowling is a transphobe to high heaven. You know, just because a work is, and even if a work is problematic, 100% problematic, that doesn't mean we shy away from it. because we can engage with it and we can talk about why it's problematic without just saying it's bad, basically, or banning it. We don't have to ban it. And again, this is an extreme example. I don't know, I think about it a lot because, you know, I was never that big of a Harry Potter fan, so whenever I found out that she's just someone whose platform I don't agree with, it was very easy for me to just stop buying her. Well, I wasn't even buying her books to begin with, but not watch the movies or the TV shows or buy the books, yada yada yada. That's not going to be easy for everyone because this, for some people, this work is just such a big part of who they are. And a book is more than its author. I think any text that you look at is ultimately going to have some progressive and regressive parts. That doesn't necessarily mean you write it off completely. That doesn't mean you ban it. We all have some type of book or speech that we find problematic or harmful, and we might think it shouldn't exist. It doesn't matter what your political views are. You have something. I'll be completely honest. I do not like Colleen Hoover. I really did not like the way she handled the domestic violence in It Ends With Us. But I'm not gonna ban that book. I can't make that decision for other people, and neither should you. That's not how this works. So what do we do with harmful or problematic books? I'm using that in the loosest term. Whatever you think is problematic applies here. So you can start, if you run into a problematic work at your library, you can start by putting it back on the shelf. Walk past the shelf, walk past the stand where it's being advertised, and go find something different. And if it really bothers you, just request a different book, a book that you would like from your library. They'll be more than happy to talk to, I promise. Some libraries have a form on their website. Others, you might have to like go up to the circulation desk or call them, but either way, this is a really common request they get. But if a work really, really bothers you to the point that none of this helps, ask yourself why. If it makes you uncomfortable, think on it. Explore that. Just because something's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's harmful, doesn't mean it's bad. Breaking a new pair of shoes, that can be uncomfortable, but isn't it nice when you finally have the new pair of shoes? Remember that harmful is sometimes just a buzzword used to attack people who have fewer access to freedom of speech and expression. Think about the people we were talking about at the beginning of the episode who have fewer access to wealth and therefore less access to speech. Think about the types of books that get banned. Those are targeting specific groups. They're not about what's harmful. I'm going to leave you with one more example. In prison libraries, there are a lot of books that are banned for protection reasons because they're considered dangerous for inmates to have access to. And you may be thinking, yeah, you know, I guess you don't want an inmate to have access to information about how to escape the prison, how to build a bomb, how to make a shiv, etc. Sometimes that's the case. But in Texas, Hitler's manifesto, you know, the thing that led to the death of millions of people, including people who are Jewish, Romani, or gay, that is allowed in prison libraries. You know what isn't? The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Text that talks about racism, sexual violence, and homosexuality. One of those texts led to the deaths of millions of people and started a world war. The other won a Pulitzer. This isn't about keeping people safe. This is about silencing people. And come on, we're better than that. Thank you for listening. I'll see you all next week.